Hey guys, my name is Rob Noire, and today I have a very special video for you all about some extremely interesting gaming tech that came out not that long ago. I am of course talking about the mClassic device and the mCable Gaming Edition by Marseille Inc. So a few years ago, a company called Marseille Inc. popped out of virtually nowhere and started producing a few different interesting devices to kind of help you upgrade your gaming experience. There's the mCable Cinema Edition, Gaming Edition, and the mClassic. And the mClassic device that they came out with was actually crowdfunded. They went through Indiegogo, and I was actually one of many backers who were very excited to see this device become a reality. What exactly are the mClassic device and the mCable Gaming Edition? The company had a very smart marketing campaign where they kind of compared them to being external graphics processors, and that's sort of right and sort of just kind of marketing buzzwords, but essentially at their core they are upscalers. However, they're much more than just traditional upscalers. To understand exactly what they do though and why it's so unique, you have to understand what upscaling is and why it's so important. So I'm going to explain the basics of upscaling for those of you who might not be familiar with what it is and why we have to use it. But if you happen to know everything that there is to know about upscaling, feel free to skip to this timestamp right here. Every device that outputs video outputs at a specific resolution. This is whether it's a video game console, a TV box, whatever. And ever since video became a thing, there have been many different resolutions used. Now, some of the more common resolutions, especially when it came to video games, were 240p, 480p, 720p, 1080p, and 4K. I'm willing to bet you've heard of at least some of these before, and actually if you go and you scroll down and you click on the gear on this YouTube video, you can actually select several of those for what quality you want to watch this video in. Now let's take the NES for example. This is a very old console that runs in 240p. And now back in the day, you would actually hook your NES up to a CRT television, which probably supported resolutions even lower than 240p and probably went as high as 480p. Playing this on a CRT, the image would be the correct size, it would appear sharp or as sharp as the TV could make it, and everything would look great. Now what happens if you want to play this on a modern television, let's say one that supports 1080p? And what your TV is going to do is take that very small image, then it will scale it up until it fits the 1920 by 1080 screen. Now, anytime that your TV or monitor is getting a video signal that is a low resolution, it will scale it up to fit the TV. Now, the processing that your TV or monitor has to perform to upscale these low resolutions into the modern resolutions will usually introduce a fair bit of input lag. TVs and monitors are not particularly great at this, which is why your image probably would look like this, what I'm showing here. Now, if you want to get a clear image that looks extremely good, what you have to use is actually an external upscaler. And in the retro gaming community, there's pretty much three upscalers that are well known and well renowned. That would be the Microsoft XRGB Mini FrameMeister, the OSSC, the open source scan converter, which is my personal favorite, or even the RetroTink. Now, these devices are designed specifically to take these low resolution consoles and upscale them to the higher resolutions while preserving all the quality they can. External upscalers are designed to introduce little to no input lag whatsoever. That is one of their main functions. Now, it's worth noting that none of these external upscalers can actually add detail to the image. That's not what they do. They will take a low resolution and then upscale it extremely clearly and sharply to a higher resolution. But for example, it's not going to make the graphics look any better than they would have playing on a lower resolution television. And that's where the mClassic and the mCable kind of come in and do something very unique. So not only are these devices upscalers, taking lower resolutions and upscaling them to higher resolutions, but they also have some special features in there that kind of set them apart. There's apparently an algorithm in it which identifies elements from the video that could use some smoothing features. So for example, some 3D games have kind of jagged edges, and this is designed to smooth those out, while at the same time sharpening elements like text or the HUD. Now in practice, this can be kind of a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we'll get into that more later in the video. Now it's also worth noting that both the mClassic and the mCable Gaming Edition have to be powered via USB. Now this isn't a huge deal, but just something to keep in mind. You might need some extra plugins and outlets. As well, the mCable Gaming Edition will stretch any video resolution that you give it to fill the screen. Now, a lot of monitors and TVs do give you the ability to kind of shrink and stretch images horizontally as much as you want, so you can fix this on your own if this is an issue. Personally, I hate it when devices do this. I find it so lazy when they give the excuse, well, you can probably just fix it on your TV, maybe if it supports it. But I'm not going to rag too hard on the mCable Gaming Edition for this, because the mClassic actually has a switch on the side which allows you to adjust this. The switch has 3 positions with the pass-through if you don't want it working at all. It has a position for retro games where it will maintain its 4:3 aspect ratio. Then it has a position for full-on where it will stretch the image, all that jazz. Because obviously this is version 2, this is the revision where they listen to what people have been saying. I'm not going to harp too much on the mCable for not doing this. Just keep in mind that this is a feature that the mCable doesn't have, and anytime you see footage in this video that is captured with the mCable, if it is supposed to be in 4:3, I will be manually making it 4:3 in editing, just because it's too hard to compare like a stretched one with one how it's supposed to look. So just keep that in mind. Now these 2 devices are marketed as plug and play, as in you just get the device, you just get the console, go, and you're good to go. And that is also kind of reflected in their packaging, in that there's very little that comes with them. There's like no instructions, no manual, nothing, which to me was kind of a flaw. Because it's worth noting that they don't handle every single resolution the same way, and I would have really liked to have that information available with the product instead of having to go online and look that up on their website. I feel like that's kind of a bit of a mistake to not include that, and I don't know why they didn't do that. Another thing worth mentioning about the whole plug and play aspect of these is that unlike a lot of the other upscalers I mentioned, these will only accept a video signal over an HDMI cable. So while the OSSC and FrameMeister can take, like Component, S-Video, SCART, all these other things, for this you're stuck with HDMI. So I am going to show you a footage comparison later on in the video, and essentially to hook a lot of the older and retro consoles up to the mClassic and the mCable Gaming Edition, I had to use HDMI adapters for these old consoles. Whenever I use one, I'll call it out, I'll tell you exactly what it is, but that also means you're a little bit at the whim of what method you use to connect via HDMI when it comes to older consoles. So that's something to also keep in mind, that you might have to buy these, and if they're not the greatest, it will affect the video output. Another thing that you can do is actually chain multiple mClassics together, or chain an mCable and an mClassic, that kind of thing, to kind of, in theory, get double the benefits, double the effects. But I gotta say, in practice, from my test, this is generally not a good idea. Now, like I've mentioned, what these devices do is awesome, but it's not quite perfect, and when you put more than one together, it kind of doubles down on some of the more negative aspects. For example, a lot of the contrast can kind of go a bit crazy, it can kind of be way more blurry than it should be. We'll get into more of that later on in the video, but it's just worth noting that that's a thing. And one common misconception that I've seen about the Marseille products is that you always want to put in the lowest resolution possible so that the device will do all the heavy lifting. For example, if you can set your console to output at a lower resolution, you should. That way this will do all of the upscaling, none of it is handled by the console itself. And while in theory this makes sense, I've done extensive testing on this, and I will show more of it later in the video, but I'm showing some of the footage here. In every single test I've done, the higher the resolution that you start with, at least up until 720p, the better the image will look coming out the other side. So as far as I can tell, there's no reason to lower your console's resolution below 720p. And honestly, I don't feel like there's that big of a difference between 720p and 1080p run through an mClassic anyways, no matter what they say. Alright guys, so what I'm going to do here is show you a comparison of literally every single console that I have at my disposal to show you what the footage looks like with the mClassic and without. When applicable, I'll show you what the original console can output like just on its own, and then what it will look like when going through an mClassic, and then if there's like third-party alternatives that can already boost that original console's video output, I'll show you what those look like on their own, and then what those look like running through the mClassic. As you can probably tell, there's a lot to cover here, so I am going to be going a little bit faster than I usually would in a video like this. If you need some clarification, I recommend you just pause or slow down the video, but I have to go fast, otherwise this video is going to be like 3 hours long. It's probably already got a pretty long runtime, not gonna lie. I'll also pin a comment down below which will have timestamps for all the specific consoles that I cover, so if you're looking for how it looks with a specific console, you can jump right to it. So first off, we're going to start with the 2D consoles. The very first console we're going to look at is going to be the Atari 2600. My preferred way of playing Atari 2600 games is using the Retron 77 by Hyperkin using custom firmware. This thing outputs in 720p HD. As you can see here, the Marseille products are not really designed for 2D consoles. It's not really what they're best at. So while you might get a few tiny benefits, in general, it's not going to do a whole lot to help. Next, we'll move on to the original NES, which was captured using a simple AV to HDMI converter, which outputs very rough-looking 720p, and also the retro USB AVS, which also outputs 720p. And something that comes out very clearly in this test is how the edges of the pixels become a lot less sharp, and you also get some kind of contrast artifacts around them. Next up is the Sega Master System, played using the power base converter on an original Genesis, using a Hyperkin HD cable for the Genesis, which outputs at 720p, and also played using the analog Mega SG with the Master System converter, which outputs at 1080p. This is another console where I do believe that the best third-party alternative greatly exceeds what can be done with the mClassic or mCable. And also on the edges of Alex Kidd here in the zoom, you can very clearly see how much it has been smoothed out. Again, I think it's important to know what these 2D games will look like in case you want to include this device in your setup, but it's really not optimized for them. Now we're going to jump over to the Super Nintendo, and it's being played using the analog Super NT because I do not own an original SNES. This console outputs in 1080p HD. The Super Nintendo is yet another 2D console that doesn't really benefit that much from the upscaling of the mClassic, although I will say that the contrast options offered by the device do make the colors pop a little bit more without significantly reducing the quality like on the even older generation. I was also really hopeful that maybe on some of the 3D games on the Super Nintendo it would have a better effect like Star Fox here, but to be honest, it didn't really do anything desirable. Next up is the Sega Genesis, which was recorded off of the original console using the Hyperkin HD cable, which outputs 720p, and also recorded off of the analog Mega SG, outputting 1080p. The Genesis performs about as well as the Super Nintendo does when using the Marseille products, which is to say it still does make it a little bit blurry. But using both the original hardware and the third-party alternative here shows a really good example of how the better the resolution you put in, the better the result you will get out. Next up is the Sega CD, recorded using a Model 2 Genesis and Model 2 CD, using again that Hyperkin HD cable that outputs at 720p, and also recorded using the analog Mega SG attached to a Model 1 Sega CD, which again outputs at 1080p. When it comes to the Sega CD, I have one thing to say when it comes to the Marseille products: do not use with FMV games. That low quality video looks horrible, even worse than it would on its own. Otherwise, you're getting pretty much the same as the Genesis. Next up is the Sega 32X, played using the Tower of Power, Model 2 Genesis, Model 2 CD attached, using the Hyperkin HD TV cable for the Genesis again, which outputs 720p. 32X also doesn't benefit all that much from the Marseille products, about the same as the Genesis, Super Nintendo, maybe even a little worse off, it's hard to say. Next up, we'll be covering the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. These are being played through the Game Boy player attached to the bottom of a Gamecube. It's outputting video via the Eon HD adapter for the Gamecube, which does 480p. Now you do actually see a bit of an improvement here when it comes to the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance when using the Marseille products, because 480p is such a low resolution signal that the mClassic is able to do more good than harm here. I also tried out some of the 3D Game Boy Advance games to see how those would look, and more or less what you'd expect. So now we're going to do what I'm calling the early 3D consoles. These are consoles that had 3D graphics and were mainly 3D based games. However, they still ran in 4:3 standard definition. It was before HD and widescreen was a thing. And we'll start with the N64. My N64 has what's known as the Ultra HDMI mod, so it does output in 1080p. Also internally, I can set the resolution output to lower, so to mimic some of the HD adapters for the N64 that are out there, I also set it to 480p to use that for comparison. So the N64 is a console that I don't think actually benefits much from the Marseille products. All of the games were designed to have very sharp pixels making up these 3D models. And the mClassic and mCable can't smooth this out enough to make them into smooth polygons. It would need a lot more aggressive filtering to get it up to the smoothness of, say, like an N64 emulator, so I feel like it just doesn't really add much here. Next up is the PlayStation 1, and I do not own an original PS1, so the games will be played using my launch PS3. Now this will output in 1080p, but I also set the resolution down to the lowest it'll let me to compare as if we were using an HDMI adapter. The PlayStation 1 fares a lot better than the N64 in my opinion. Most of the games run using the mClassic do show signs of improvement. And while it's not perfect, I do find that it does help improve the quality of this console. One thing to note though is that there are a lot of really awesome 2D games on the PlayStation 1 as well, and these are subject to the same effects that you would see on like the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis that I showed earlier. Now we'll do what's a bit of an odd console out here, the Nintendo DS, and the only way I'm able to play this is as a downloadable title on the Wii U, which of course has 1080p output. So DS games really don't benefit a whole lot from this. It's kind of in the same boat as the Super Nintendo, but I wanted to throw this out there so you know what it might look like. Next up is the Nintendo Gamecube, played again using an HD adapter from Eon, which outputs at 480p. So the Gamecube is definitely a console that can benefit quite a bit from the mClassic and the mCable. It is worth noting though that the contrast can be a little bit much on some Gamecube games like Mario Sunshine. In fact, this is the console that first brought to my attention the negative effects of chaining two Marseille products together. Next up is the PlayStation 2. Here I have the slim version of the console using a pound HDMI adapter cable which outputs in 720p, as well as using my launch PS3 to play the PS2 games and output in 1080p. PlayStation 2 is a little bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the Marseille products. Most PlayStation 2 games actually output in 480i, which is a resolution that the Marseille products do not handle well. Using an HD adapter or the PlayStation 3 kind of gets around it a little bit in that you are outputting 720p or higher, but that doesn't fix a lot of the inherent blurriness. And the mCable and the mClassic can kind of double down on the blurriness a little bit. This was one of the consoles I was most excited to test out with the Marseille products, and to be honest, it doesn't really do all too much. They look a little bit better while using it, but nothing amazing, nothing drastic. Next up is the original Wii. I don't personally own one currently because I gave mine away to my parents a couple years back, so I borrowed a friend of mine's Wii for this, and I used the Sewell Wii to HDMI adapter, which outputs 480p. As well, I also used my Wii U to play these Wii games, outputting in both 480p and in 1080p to see the difference when used with the Marseille products. So the Wii is a bit of a strange console in that it's only 480p output, but it does allow for a stretched widescreen mode, and this is mainly what you're going to be seeing here. And when playing these Wii games on a Wii U, originally I always thought that the graphics usually looked a little bit too sharp, a little bit too jagged, or too blurry in some cases. But I gotta say that the mCable and the mClassic really kind of smooth out these jagged edges and make these Wii games look as good as they really can. So all in all, I think the Wii is a great candidate for using the mClassic or mCable, regardless of whether you're playing on the original console or on the Wii U. It really does offer graphical improvements here, in my opinion. Next up is the original Xbox. Now, I don't personally own an original Xbox, but I do have an Xbox One with backwards compatibility, and to simulate what it's like to play an original Xbox with an HD adapter, I lowered the resolution of the Xbox One to 720p, and I will be comparing that as well to its native resolution of 1080p. Now, it's definitely worth noting that the base footage of these games is going to look better than if it was played on the original console. Xbox One backwards compatibility does improve the overall visual fidelity, improve textures, all that jazz. One of the things I really noticed with this console though is just how much the mClassic and mCable can affect the brightness of the video image. For example, in Morrowind here, it's really difficult to even see what's going on the screen. As well, this is also one of those tests where it showed that a 720p image run through the mClassic will come out the other end looking a lot like the 1080p image being run through an mClassic. There's not a ton of difference in the upscaling with the lower resolution. And now it's time to cover what I'm calling modern consoles. These are consoles that output 720p or 1080p HD over an HDMI cable. We'll start with the PlayStation 3. So the PlayStation 3 is a console that actually benefits quite a bit from the mClassic and mCable, although it can be a little bit subtle and hard to tell in some cases. Generally speaking, the high contrast isn't really an issue, and smoothing out some of the jagged edges really does go a long way. So all in all, I think the PlayStation 3 is a great candidate to use with the mClassic. It really has a lot of benefits and very few downsides. And next up is the Xbox 360, which once again will be done using the Xbox One backwards compatibility. And the Xbox One does output in 1080p, which some Xbox 360 games do as well. And I've also set the Xbox One to output at 720p to also give the comparison with that running through the mClassic. Again, because of the improvements from backwards compatibility on the Xbox One, this will be looking a little better than it would through an actual Xbox 360. Well, I did notice that some of the games, the contrast becomes an issue again, making the games a little bit too dark for my tastes. That being said, the Xbox 360 does seem to benefit from the mClassic a decent amount. This is a pretty good choice to use the mClassic with, either through the original console or through an Xbox One. It does improve things at least a little bit. Next up is the Wii U. Plain and simple, it outputs 1080p. In general, I don't really notice that much of a difference when using the Wii U with the mClassic. There are some slight, subtle improvements, but nothing that really jumps out at you. Some of this could have to do with a lot of cartoony, already stylized graphics though. So to be honest, for the most part, the Wii U is kind of take it or leave it. It's not super necessary, but if you do plan on using the Wii U to play like original Wii games, I would recommend having the mClassic or mCable to go along with it. Next up is the PlayStation 4, but it's also worth noting that I did also borrow this console from a friend for this recording because I do not own one. The PS4 outputs 1080p. Now, I'm not an expert on the PS4, having only ever really played one at friends' places or back when my old roommate used to own one many years ago, but the Marseille devices seem to have the same effect on this console as they do pretty much all the modern ones, in that the improvements that they make are very subtle and not super in your face or noticeable, but they definitely don't hurt anything, and the contrast issues aren't as noticeable on these. So again, I don't feel like the modern consoles benefit a ton from the mClassic and mCable, but it doesn't hurt anything, so it is worth using if you want to. Next up is the Xbox One, a console I'm extremely familiar with, although I mainly do use it just as a media streaming device. It outputs 1080p. The mClassic and mCable actually have a little bit of a detrimental effect on some artsy games like Cuphead here, not just on the Xbox One, but just on a bunch of different consoles. But when it comes to something a little bit more traditional like Doom Eternal or Dead Rising here, it does seem to improve the graphics slightly. Again, it's very subtle on the modern consoles. Overall, again, I definitely don't think it's something you absolutely need for the Xbox One, but it does improve it a tiny bit, so if you have it, you might as well have it hooked up. And finally, we get to Nintendo's latest offering, the Switch, which of course does 1080p. Now, much like the Wii U, the kind of cartoony style that a lot of these Nintendo Switch games take on kind of works against the mClassic. As in, they're supposed to look the way they look, more smoothing and sharpening isn't really what it's all about. But again, like most of the modern consoles, the mClassic doesn't have that much of an effect anyways, it's very subtle. So all in all, it does a decent job with the Switch, all things considered. I definitely don't think it's an essential piece of hardware to have to go along with the Switch, especially it's pretty hard to plug into the back of the dock anyways, but it's not going to mess anything up. If you have it, you might as well use it. And finally, I want to talk about the idea of HD remasters, because despite what some people have been saying, even if you hook up an old game to the mClassic, it's not going to be as drastic of an improvement as an actual HD remaster. Even if an older game is just ported to a newer console with a better resolution, that is going to be more of a bump in fidelity quality than the mClassic or mCable can provide. For example, here we're looking at Ocarina of Time on the N64, and the GameCube port on its own looks better than the N64 version using the mClassic or mCable. Now, of course, you can use the mClassic to further improve on these HD remasters, but it's just very important to know that it's not going to give you the same result as a true HD remaster, taking an old console and an old game and plugging it to a Marseille product. It's just not going to do it. That's not what it's designed for. It will make it look better, but not that level of better. So at the end of the day, is the mClassic a device that you want to have in your gaming arsenal? And honestly, I think yes, but you have to understand its shortcomings. So first of all, if you're thinking about either the mClassic or the mCable Gaming Edition, no matter what, go for the mClassic. The switch on the side for aspect ratio means it has so much more usability than the old cable. And as well, in terms of the output resolutions, this thing is superior. Essentially, the mClassic is an extremely good 1440p upscaler. Now, if you're not familiar with the 1440p resolution, well, that's not that surprising. It's not super common. It's more common actually in like the PC gaming world. There's a lot of really good 1440p monitors for PCs. It's essentially the stopgap between 1080p and 4K. And the mClassic does an extremely good and clean job of upscaling literally everything to 1440p. The mCable does not. It's also worth noting that both of these retail for about the same price, although I notice the mCable seems to go on sale more often. So no matter what, go for the mClassic. It shouldn't even be a question at this point. Otherwise, though, the two devices pretty much output the exact same thing, as you probably noticed in the comparison. There's almost zero difference between the footage. So essentially, it's the exact same technology, just the mClassic has a few more bells and whistles. In terms of the shortcomings, though, something worth noting is the 4K upscaling that they promote with this thing. You're really not going to be able to take advantage of that. So while these devices do have the ability to upscale some resolutions to 4K, the resolutions you're going to have to use to be able to achieve this, well, they're such low frame rates that you're pretty much never going to come across them. I've seen a bunch of comments where they point out that pretty much the only time you're going to be able to use this feature is when watching a movie with your console, when the movie runs in a lower frame rate, but even that can be hard to pull off. Typically, your consoles are going to be running at 60 frames per second, and this thing can only upscale to 4K if you're running at 30 frames or lower. That's kind of a big problem. Like, I tried a bunch of games that are supposed to be running at low resolutions with low frame rates, and no matter what I did, I could not get a 4K signal. It's worth noting that my capture card supports 4K, it also tells you exactly what's coming in, and even my monitor will tell you exactly what resolution it's getting in. I could not get 4K out of this thing no matter what I did. I'm not saying it's possible, I'm just saying that for 99% of your usage, it's pretty much not really a thing. However, as I mentioned, it is a great 1440p upscaler. And 1440p is higher than 1080p and will look better on a 4K monitor. So keep that in mind, just know it's not going to be the full 4K experience. And this is also why in the comparisons I did a 2x zoom on the 1080p footage, because then you actually get to see what it would look like in 4K when everything is kind of blown up and the flaws come out a little bit more. Now, another one of the shortcomings of this device is the contrast it does. It does add contrast to all of the colors. You probably noticed that every time this thing was plugged in, the footage got at least a little bit darker. And while I do feel it does a good job, like it usually makes a lot of the colors and everything pop, it does introduce some kind of like outlines around the edges of objects, especially when it's like a dark object on a light background. I should have some footage to demonstrate this here. And this is also one of the points where chaining more than one of these devices together really brings out the flaws, because a double contrast applied to this really makes everything even darker. And the really cool smoothing feature this thing does, well, when it doubles down on that, I find it can just make everything a blurry mess. Like, it's touch and go already, depending on the console and the game, and putting two together, I just don't feel like it looks good ever. Like, there was literally not a single game in any of the footage that I recorded there where I thought it looked better when I chained two together than just one on its own. So while you can do this, I do not personally recommend it. Now, onto the topic of the cool little smoothing and sharpening filters that this thing does, well, they're not perfect. Now, if you're playing a 3D game that was already a little bit blurry, it can kind of double down on that and not really look the greatest. I noticed this a lot, for example, in like the PS2 games. It can also have difficulty identifying what are elements to be sharpened and what are elements to be smoothed. And as well, games that have kind of like a unique art style, like the South Park game, like Cuphead, or even like Heavy Rain, had kind of like this strange filter over it. The blurring filter can kind of like attack that aggressively and just make it look strange and not as good as it did originally. Now, overall though, I do feel like the mClassic brings a lot to the table, and about 90 to 95% of cases improves the way a game will look. Now, I do feel that this device is well worth having in your gaming arsenal, especially when it comes to 3D games. And in action, generally speaking, this thing is great. Like, of course, we're breaking down footage here and really examining it under a microscope. Of course, that's not what you're going to be doing when you're just popping in a game and playing. So the few games that this thing kind of has a negative effect on, you probably will not notice in the course of just a regular gaming session. I definitely think that like the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 generation is kind of like the sweet spot for this. The generation that benefits the most while also requiring the least amount of work from you. Like, you're not going to have to buy a bunch of HDMI adapters and do all this stuff. It's more or less actually plug and play like it says. Having this device plugged into those consoles has a large effect on the graphical fidelity and how great it looks. So I would highly recommend this, especially for that era of console gaming. So yeah guys, that pretty much wraps up this video. Again, I think this is a really great device. I'm glad that it exists. I do recommend you get it. Just you have to keep in mind its shortcomings. You have to keep in mind that it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution, that you kind of have to go on a case-by-case basis if you're looking for the best possible quality. But in general, it will improve the graphics of pretty much any console you hook it up to after the 2D era. Yeah guys, that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this video informative. I hope if you were thinking about purchasing an mClassic or an mCable gaming edition for yourself, well, now you have a lot more information to help you make an informed choice. And as always guys, I will see you in the next video. Hey, thanks a lot for making it all the way to the end of the video. I do want to say that this video was a beast to make. I mean, it took me over 2 months and 200 hours of work. So if you did find it helpful, I would love to hear all about it down in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more in-depth reviews and videos like this from me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified whenever I release them. Alright guys, thanks a lot and take care.